You're listening to Strictly Business Podcast with Lindsay Williams.
I haven't spoken to my next guest since around about early to mid-February, I think it was, and he's been very vocal on social media about the current situation when it comes to COVID-19, coronavirus, and the way that governments and people are treating this particular pandemic, as it's called. His name is Russell Lamberti. He's the founder of ETM Macro Advisors. Russell, you've been very, very, very vocal indeed about this. In fact, you've got a bit of a bee in your bonnet.
I do, Lindsay. Hi, it's good to be with you again, mate.
Thank you.
I think that we've taken a very, very radical course of action. Global lockdowns, and particularly the kind that we're experiencing in South Africa, which is extremely draconian, I just think is a radical treatment for a problem that's clearly significant. I think the more data that comes out, we're getting a better handle on the scope and the scale of what COVID-19 is. And I think the good news is that while it's clearly nasty, it's not as bad as original fears, led us to believe. And I think that even if you might justify early lockdowns as a precautionary approach, I think that we've got sufficient evidence now to suggest that they can and must start being lifted very, very quickly, because I think that we are starting to create unimaginable, unintended consequences from the macroeconomic sort of calamity that's now emerging. And so that really is my position. I think that that we need to continue with sensible disease risk management. We have a much better idea of who the high risk group is now, given the data that we've seen. We don't know everything about this virus, I grant you that, but we certainly have a much clearer picture. The picture that's far less clear is just how bad these lockdowns are going to get for not just regular, employment and income sort of statistics, but for world poverty, for poor people, particularly in South Africa, yes, who are, I think, coming to a point of real desperation now. And I would like to see much more proactive opening up again under sensible sort of risk management protocols. So that's the bee that I've got in my bonnet. I think we're doing some real damage here.
Yes, I think we are. I mean, what you're doing essentially is playing the macro environment, the macroeconomic environment, and our economic futures versus human life. Now, how do you do that? Do you accept then that if we do completely abandon the lockdown scenario, then there is going to be some collateral damage and we just have to live with that, or rather die with that?
I think it's life versus life, Lindsay. I don't think it's economy versus life. I think that when you have dramatic lockdowns like we're seeing, and you thrust people into joblessness, you thrust them into hunger, to in the worst cases, severe malnutrition and poverty, you're talking real mortality-based problems here. You're talking about increased risk of tuberculosis. You're talking about significantly increased risk of all the kinds of diseases that are associated with poverty, higher child mortality, higher infant mortality. So I don't accept that it's a sort of taking collateral damage on the chin type situation. I think we're creating tremendous collateral damage. And I think that the evidence that we have up until now suggests that the trade-off is between very old, very sick people, by and large, overwhelmingly, versus, I think many, many more, probably, 2 orders of magnitude more, very, very vulnerable young people now who have their whole lives ahead of them. I think we're making a very, very risky and ill-advised trade-off here. So I think it's lives versus lives, as I say, and I think that policymakers probably haven't fully thought through what the risks that they're now creating through unintended consequences. And so now no one is omniscient and no one is perfectly prescient. And so I would say that the risk management principle here is not necessarily to make, for a single policymaker to make the perfect choice and the perfect decision. I think that the principle here is allow for as much decentralized risk management as possible. allow people to work, allow them to work safely, allow them to manage their risk of catching the virus, to treating the virus, and to still earning a livelihood to put food on the table for their families. Everyone faces a different stack of risks in this equation. Everyone is extremely different. All regions are different, income groups are different. So I think that the principle here is to devolve risk management back down to the local and business and family and individual level.
It's difficult to do that, though, Russell. Let's say that when I grew up in England and I was educated at a state school, there would be a class between 30 and 40 kids, and there'd be little Lindsay not particularly doing that well and little Russell doing it extremely well. But unfortunately, they couldn't say, Russell, you're such a bright chap. We're going to tailor our education system towards you. And Lindsay, you're a dunce. We're going to tailor our system differently than we would with Russell, if you see what I mean. There has to be a sort of a blanket approach, and just like there has to be, I suppose, a blanket approach when it comes to this virus until we learn more about it.
No, I disagree. I mean, I think that what we're actually learning is that complex risk management requires anything but a blanket approach. And to the extent that your analogy is at all applicable to this situation, it shows the weaknesses of public schooling. It doesn't show a strength of public schooling. It shows that public schools often get it wrong, that they apply, the same approach to the wrong people. It's one of the reasons why private schooling and homeschooling is so much more popular.
Well, this was 45 years ago, and I do agree with you. I agree that the education system when I grew up was completely inadequate because people weren't guided towards the skills that they had. They weren't tested. People didn't pull me aside and say, Lindsay, you're actually quite good at this, but you're absolutely crap at this. Yeah. But anyway, I was just using the analogy, and I don't see how the government can. I
get your point, and I get where you're coming from. I as I say, I've stated my position. I think what we're seeing is that a farmer in the Karoo and a street trader in Soweto and a rural Eastern Cape dweller and a Cape Town Sea Point middle class person, these people all face very, very different realities, very, very different risks. Some of them are at risk of dying from this virus because they're perhaps very old with significant other illnesses. Some of them are young and healthy, but poor, and they need to get to work and they need to be able to earn income for their families. Everyone faces radically different choice sets here. And I just think that blanket policy for 60 million people or for 300 million people or for 1.3 billion people, I mean, it just doesn't fly as a real world risk management strategy. And I just hope, I'm pessimistic about this, but I hope that one of the lessons we learn from all this is that we can't just react with sheer panic at the first sight of any enemy, and B, that for complex things, we have to just accept that we don't have all the answers, and we certainly don't have all the answers at a centralized level. We can't keep relying on one or two men who we may or may not like, who lead countries, to get us out of these complex problems. Society is far, far more textured and nuanced than that. And I'm concerned that people are running to central government once again and haven't learned the lessons of the past and are potentially making a very big mistake again now in the present.
Undoubtedly, it's an imperfect situation that we have, but do you agree that South Africa, for example, because that's what you're focusing on at the moment as a proud South African, is, a South African, let's put it that way, is that we need a bespoke, a tailor-made approach. So, for example, you open a bar and someone's got a badge and says, well, I'm healthy and I've been tested so I can come in and have a drink. And there's some old sick person who has got a different sort of badge and is maybe vulnerable. That person can't come in. I don't think we have the resources to apply the bespoke approach, Russell.
Well, no, I think what we don't have the resources to apply is what we're doing right now, Lindsay. We don't have the resources to police 60 million people in a draconian fashion. South Africa has called up the entire military at a cost of 5 billion rand, and I expect that that'll probably grow as these things are very sticky and won't unwind very easily. If we'd spent 5 billion rand on immediately upscaling our hospital infrastructure, building temporary facilities and so on, We wouldn't need a military to enforce a draconian lockdown. I don't think we have the resources at all for what we're trying to achieve here. We're shutting down the economy. We're diminishing supply. We're diminishing the pool of wealth that the government can therefore draw on to manage this process. We now have to feed, the government now has to feed hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people. If you're talking resource constraints, that's where your resource constraints are. The other side of the equation is creating very simple, tolerable, sensible risk protocols and allowing businesses to open up and operate and innovate around those. And the question is, how do you police that? How do you administer that? You administer that like you administer every other rule in the country. Imperfectly, yes. But remember that most law enforcement happens by citizens themselves. People observe what businesses are doing. They whistle blow on businesses that are breaking the rules egregiously. And you could have age restrictions on most activities that involve public gatherings. People above a certain age for a certain length of time, unfortunately, can't participate in those activities. There are many ways to kind of skin this cat. I just think that the approach that we've taken is the real resource crunch approach. We don't have the resources to do what we're doing in South Africa.
No, we don't. You're absolutely right. And that is very draconian. I mean, I was astonished when I think it was something like 73,000 troops were called up. I don't know how many have managed to get onto the streets, but I don't quite understand that one. Do you think then, from what you've just said, that you would assign the responsibility to the individual? In other words, we become good at self-regulation?
I think there's many layers to this, Lindsay. I don't think it's about individual versus state. I think it's yes, and sure, individual, but it's also family. It's also your suburb and your community. It's the institutions of life that exist outside of the purview of the state. It's educational institutions. It's all of life. It's businesses. We I think have this assumption that only the state can A, see the risks, B, quantify them and sort of identify how bad they are, and then C, kind of implement a strategy that everyone has to follow. The truth is that all these other institutions can manage risk extremely effectively. In fact, the private sector, in many respects, shows how well it can manage risks. We have specialized risk management industries, around insurance and the actuarial industry. There are many, many solutions and many, many different ways of approaching this problem. And that's precisely how complex problems should be approached, from different angles by many different smart people. What we have done instead is we've centralized a few people around the presidency who are making very, very opaque decisions. And if they get one decision wrong, it's kind of ruinous for everyone. That's a huge gamble. This is radical stuff. What I'm proposing, Lindsay, is far more moderate and essentially decentralizes the risk, and it makes us far less prone and far less likely to have a calamitous outcome, in my view.
Okay, so they suddenly create a ministerial position, and you are at the forefront of the candidacy, and you are going to be the COVID-19 minister, or potentially. What would be your portfolio? What would you say to President Cyril Ramaphosa? How would you go about it compared to what he and his team have done?
I think the first thing you've got to do is admit what you don't know. And you seldom hear that coming out of government. The government tries to project, I suppose, an aura of omniscience. You need to talk about what you don't know and what you cannot achieve, and therefore what is best achieved outside of the purview of government. And I think what the government can do as an administrative function, as a function that administers rules and law and justice and all these things, is, I think, in an efficient, consultative way that's fed by the best data that's coming out of this global situation, is to come up with tolerable parameters around which people can then innovate themselves and manage their own risks. So, it might be, for example, that there's a very few set of very simple rules, like age restrictions, as in age caps on who can participate in certain events.
Yes.
Density caps on factories or on certain kinds of economic activity, or on travel, for example. But even under these sorts of rules, I believe that the airlines could open up again. The airlines could operate. It may be that if you're over a certain age, you don't get to fly. It may be that the airplanes are less filled with people. But I think that ultimately you can make some very simple parameters, and then you allow the private sector, you allow free society to then manage their risk from there, and then you administer that under due process without making all these new sort of ham-fisted rules and regulations. I think since the start of this lockdown situation, Lindsay, we've gotten about 500 new pages of rules and regulations. And I can promise you now that not all of those 500 pages will disappear when this is all done.
Yes, I do think that the governments around the world are not using it, but certainly are going to take advantage of this current situation. I mean, for example, in Russia, the amount of scrutiny that Russian citizens are under at the moment won't disappear once COVID-19 is over. That's an extreme event. Just in case you do become the minister of the coronavirus, could you please make the travel restrictions for people over 60? Thank you. I want to have a holiday at some stage in my life. I don't want to trivialize or be trite or dismissive of what's happening at the moment, but I do find it fascinating when it comes to the potential investment trends, when it comes to social behavior, when it comes to stupid things, like, for example, you haven't had your hair cut for 5 weeks or so. Do you go back to your old haircut, or do you grow your hair long? Do fashion trends change? Do social trends change? More importantly, does human behavior change so that you don't go to work 5 days a week or 4 days a week? You only go to work 1 day a week to say hello to a couple of people and then go back. Don't you find this prospect absolutely enthralling? Yeah,
look, these are literally, $1 million, maybe $1 billion questions that you're asking. I think that they're, depending on how long this lasts and depending on how long we are, I guess, in this posture of fear or perhaps posture of defensiveness around health risks. Yeah, there's I think going to be some fascinating little micro trends that are going to emerge. And it's really hard to pin down exactly where these are. And I know there's people a lot smarter than me who are probably thinking very hard about some of this stuff and jumping into some of these trends early. But I do think about all this. I think at a bigger picture, for me, I'm not sure that coronavirus is itself a very significant trend changer, as much as I think it's a trend accelerator. So I have a feeling that the trends that were in place and some of the big things that were in place or that were trending in place prior to coronavirus might have been accelerated by it. I just think of one example, Lindsay, being that we know we were in a world that was trending more towards nationalism and more restrictive travel and border crossings. All these things were in play, not only in the US and the UK, but it's rearing its head throughout Europe as well. And I think what's really interesting about this is, if anything, this is going to accelerate a trend like that. It's going to make people a little more wary of just letting anyone into their country. It's going to probably be an accelerant to the barriers, if you like, going up around the world. Certainly, there's been no love lost between the US and China over this coronavirus. But again, that's an accelerant of a trend that was already in play. So one more example, we had central banks looking to drop interest rates, print money. Coronavirus has accelerated that trend, incredibly. And there's many other examples I could give, and I'm sure someone really smart could give an example of where a trend may be changing and may be turning around. I'm sure that's probably also there lurking somewhere, but I think trend accelerant is a good way to think about this for now.
Yes, I mean, the obvious one is that home deliveries. I mean, it's so simple and it's so obvious, and you see the Amazon share price going to all-time record highs despite the rest of the market being under a little bit of pressure. But I mean, it's almost too obvious for that to be a trend accelerant, although a trend that was in place has been accelerated, of course.
Well, it's certainly not obvious in South Africa, Lindsay, because I think we're the only country in the world where e-commerce remains banned. So spare a thought.
Yeah. I don't understand that one, and I don't understand. Can you tell me something as well?
Irrational.
I don't want to get too colloquial here, but why is alcohol why are alcohol and cigarettes banned in South Africa? I don't quite understand that. Is that because of social unrest or something?
I think it's good old South African, paternalism that the masses can't be trusted with booze and fags, and I think it's more of this sort of petty bureaucracy that the ANC are lapping up, and in many ways, replicating from the bad old days. So I just think we're getting more of the same. I mean the ban on e-commerce is, to my mind, I can get my head around the arguments for banning alcohol. I disagree with it, but I can sort of hear the argument.
Yes.
I don't hear the argument on e-commerce. If you disallow people from going and buying clothes for the looming winter in South Africa, but you then also disallow them from getting them delivered to their house, which is about the safest way I can think from a virus perspective of buying something.
Well put.
It just beggars belief. And so therefore the only explanation is sheer pettiness and the power trip that these bureaucrats are on, and I think there's a lot to be said for that. I think we're seeing a real ominous power trip here in South Africa.
Okay, I'm having too much fun to curtail this chat, Russell, so indulge me for the next few minutes and give me some wisdom of yours from outside of the borders of the Republic of South Africa. And let's look at a couple of other countries, for example, the United States of America or the United Kingdom or even Italy. How do you think they've handled it, given the demographics and the difference in our economic and socio-economic profiles?
Yeah, great question. I think that what I am happy about is that countries have taken different paths in dealing with this. We've got the Sweden approach, perhaps the Taiwan approach is similar. We've got the Italian and Spanish approaches. Germany's a little bit different. The UK was sort of slow then fast. And America is kind of quite unique as well in that it has this very federalized system, this very federalized response. So you've actually got the different states within the United States taking very different decisions around the lockdown response. And so as a general comment, I think it's really good that we've got these different approaches because we're going to get some good data from it. That sounds very cold and clinical, but I think it's going to help us learn some important lessons as we go beyond this. What we're seeing, I think, in the data up until now, and of course, it's a minefield out there, this data. But I would say that if you had to pull back the lens, what you're seeing across all these countries is that the approach that everyone has taken, whether it's hard lockdown, immediate lockdown, delayed, the Sweden approach, which is very, very little of any kind of lockdown, but more social distancing, it seems to be that the outcome for the spread of the disease and for death is by and large quite similar. It doesn't seem to have a huge impact. Now that may change. We may get more clarity on that data as we go through time. But I think that's an interesting sort of first conclusion that we're starting to see from the data, is that it doesn't really matter that much. And I think so. Now the question is, I suppose, what does matter? Because we are seeing some countries experiencing very high death rates, like Italy, like Spain, portions of the United States, like New York. So, and even within Italy, it's mostly up in the north, in Lombardy. So it's very, 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 very regional specific, which is kind of a bit of a head scratcher as well. I guess the one thing we do know is that age is a huge factor, and underlying illnesses and comorbidities is a huge factor. But what I will say is this, Lindsay, as a final comment on this, is that these different approaches, therefore, my conclusion at this stage is that these different approaches aren't really making that much of a difference from a virus sort of epidemiological perspective, but they certainly are making a difference from an economic perspective. And what was interesting to see was in the month of March, we saw vehicle sales collapse across the whole of Europe, whether you were talking Spain or Italy, which were obvious ones. but even a place like Austria, France, Germany, a country that saw its vehicle sales numbers and therefore as a proxy for economic activity hold up, still fall, but hold up far, far better than everyone else, was in fact Sweden. And that's not surprising. They haven't shut down. So what's going on here is that Sweden may be moving into a situation where their virus outcomes are no worse than their peer group, but that their economic outcomes are certainly better. And I think that could be a very, very telling sort of data point when this is all said and done.
It's interesting, actually, because Austria has lifted its restrictions probably more than most. I think business has gone back to 40% of what it was before, which goes back to your point about individuals self-regulating. So people can go and do what they used to do, but they're choosing not to at the moment. And I live in the Netherlands right now, and I phoned a hotel the other day, and I just wanted to get some anecdotal evidence of what's going on. I thought maybe their rates had gone down from 150 euros a night to maybe 30, 40 euros a night just to get people through the door, but not a bit of it. In fact, they've gone up a little bit. And 4 or 5 weeks ago, I phoned this particular hotel and the manager said, we've got one room occupied at the moment. Now, I spoke to them 3 days ago and I said, what's the update? He said, we've now got 50 rooms because the Dutch people are so fed up with not being able to go out to a restaurant that they're booking a room at our hotel just for a night in order to get a meal delivered to their room from our kitchen because they're so fed up with cooking at home. And these are the sort of little micro trends that tell me that maybe something is going to happen. Just very final question. I promise it is the last one. I speak to somebody who says we're going to go back to normal life as soon as the restrictions are lifted. Other people are saying, no, this has changed everything. Where do you stand? Left, right, or somewhere in the middle?
At risk of being the fence sitter, I do kind of feel it initially will look like something in the middle there. I think that there's no doubt, there's no chance, should I say, that everything gets lifted and we click our fingers and we go immediately back to where we were. I agree with you on that. That's very, very improbable. And as you say, you're seeing signs of that in Austria and practically in the Netherlands. Very, very strange kind of things going on. So I don't think we go back to normal immediately. But equally, I think that the people who say this changes everything, the this changes everything crowd, I think are overstating it. I think they're overstating the case. I think it potentially changes everything to the extent that we perpetuate government's right and government's ability to severely and significantly control how society behaves and the kinds of things we can do. One of the things I'm worried about, for example, we saw post 9/11 the ramping up of airport security.
Yes.
Post COVID, I can only imagine what a nightmare airports are going to become in terms of not only security screenings but then health screenings. And so travel, I think, is one of the areas where we're going to see this change, most lasting and most frustrating. Probably, I think it's going to be very, very onerous and unenviable to travel now and to move through these busy airports. I think it's going to be a bit of a nightmare. So that's those sorts of areas concern me, and I suppose there's a few more that I do worry about. I think this will take us a few months to get over, but normal life can resume. I think the big issue for me is that people have to demand and fight for their civil liberties again. When all this blows over, the last thing we want is to be left with very, very overbearing, sort of soft tyrannies, if you like. And I think that's a real concern I have, and I hope that people can spot that risk and try to resist that.
Yes, indeed. In the words of the poet Robert Frost, very, very simple statement he made, life goes on. Russell, thank you so much for your wisdom. That's Russell Lamberti, the founder of ETM Macro Advisors in the Western Cape. The views and opinions expressed in these podcasts are those of Lindsay Williams and various contributors and do not reflect the policy, position or opinion of any other agency, organisation, employer or company associated with strictlybusinesspodcast.com. Assumptions made on the analyses are not reflective of the position of any other entity other than the speaker or the author. And since we are critically thinking human beings, these views are always subject to change, revision and rethinking at any time. Please do not hold us to them in perpetuity.